Jeroboam. Jeroboam was the true disciple of this great prophet. His doctrine was as pure as the new garment Ahijah wore when he met Jeroboam near Jerusalem, and his learning exceeded that of all other scholars of his time. The prophet was in the habit of discussing secret love with Jeroboam and other subjects in the Torah whose existence was wholly unknown to others. Had Jeroboam proved himself worthy of his high position, the length of his reign would have equaled David's. It was his pride that led him into destruction. He set up the golden calves as objects to be worshipped by the people, in order to change their habit of going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. He knew that in the temple only members of the royal house of David were privileged to sit down. No exception could be made, even in the favor of Jeroboam, and so he would have to stand while Rehoboam would be seated. Rather than appear in public as the subordinate of the Judean king, he introduced the worship of idols, which secured him royal prerogatives. In the execution of his plan, he proceeded with great cunning, and his reputation as a profound scholar and pious saint served him in his masquerade. This was his method. He seated an impious man next to a pious man, and then said to each couple, "Will you put your signature to anything I intend to do?" The two would answer yes. "Do you want me as king?" he would then ask, only to receive another answer of yes. "And you will do whatever I order?" he continued. "Yes," was the reply. "Am I to infer, then, that you will even pay worship to idols if I command it?" said Jeroboam. "God forbid!" the pious member of the couple would exclaim, whereon his impious companion, who was in league with the king, would turn on him and say, "Can you really suppose for an instant that a man like Jeroboam would serve idols? He only wishes to put our loyalty to the test." Through such machinations, he succeeded in obtaining the signatures of the most pious, even the signature of the prophet Ahijah. Now Jeroboam had the people in his power, and he could exact the vilest deeds from them. So entrenched, Jeroboam brought about the division between Judah and Israel, an accomplishment which his father, Sheba, the son of Bishri, had not been able to do under David, because God desired to have the temple erected before the split occurred. Not yet satisfied, Jeroboam sought to involve the 10 tribes in a war against Judah and Jerusalem. But the people of the northern kingdom refused to enter into hostilities with their brethren, or with the ruler of their brethren, a descendant of David. Jeroboam appealed to the elders of the Israelites, and they referred him to the Danites, the most efficient of their warriors. But they swore by the head of Dan, the ancestor of their tribe, that they would never consent to shed the blood of their brethren. They were even on the point of rising against Jeroboam, and the clash between them and the followers of Jeroboam was prevented only because God prompted the Danites to leave Palestine. Their first plan was to journey to Egypt and take possession of the land, but they gave that up when their princes reminded them of the biblical prohibition against dwelling in Egypt. Likewise, they were restrained from attacking the Edomites, Ammonites, and Moabites, for the Torah commands considerate treatment of them. Finally, they decided to go to Egypt, but not stay there, but only to pass through to Ethiopia. The Egyptians were in great terror of the Danites, and their warriors occupied the roads traveled by them. Arrived in Ethiopia, the Danites slew a part of the population and exacted tribute from the rest. The departure of the Danites relieved Judah from the apparent invasion by Jeroboam, but danger arose from another quarter. Shishak, the ruler of Egypt, who was the father-in-law of Solomon, came to Jerusalem and demanded his daughter's inheritance. He carried off the throne of Solomon and also the treasures, which the Israelites had taken from the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus. So the Egyptian money returned to its source. The 2 Abijahs. Jeroboam did not entirely forego his plan of a campaign against Judah, but it was not executed until Abijah had succeeded his father Rehoboam on the throne of Jerusalem. The Judean king was victorious. However, he could not long enjoy the fruits of his victory. He died shortly after, his death brought about by his own crimes. In his war against Jeroboam, he had indulged in excessive cruelty. He ordered the corpses of the enemy to be mutilated, and permitted them to be buried only after putrefaction had set in. Such savagery was all the more unpleasant as it prevented many widows from entering into a second marriage. Mutilating the corpses had made identification impossible, and so it was left doubtful whether their husbands were among the dead. Moreover, Abijah used the most disrespectful language about the prophet Abijah, the Shilonite. He called him a son of Belial in his address to the people on Mount Zemaraim. That, in itself, merited severe punishment. Finally, his zeal for the true worship of God, which Abijah had used for the reason of the war between himself and Jeroboam, cooled quickly. When he obtained possession of Bethel, he failed to do away with the golden calves. In this respect, his namesake, the Israelite king Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, was by far his superior. By removing the guards stationed at the frontier, he defied the command of his father, who had decreed the death penalty for pilgrimages to Jerusalem. More than this, he himself ventured to go up to Jerusalem in fulfillment of his religious duty. ASSA. Asa, the son of Abijah of Judah, was a worthier and more pious ruler than his father had been. He did away with the gross worship of Priapus, to which his mother was devoted. To reward him for his piety, God gave him victory over Zerah, the king of the Ethiopians. As a result of this victory, he came again into the possession of the throne of Solomon and of the treasures Shishak had taken from his grandfather, which Zerah in turn now wrested from Shishak. Asa himself did not long keep them. Baasha, the king of Israel, together with Ben-Hadad, the Aramean king, attacked Asa, who appeased Ben-Hadad by giving him his newly acquired treasures. For this the prophet justly rebuked him, for fearing princes instead of listening to God. And that in spite of the fact that divine help had been visible in his conflicts with the Ethiopians and the Luban, for there had been no need for battle with them. In response to his mere prayer, God had slain the enemy. In general, Asa showed little confidence in God. He rather trusted in his own skill. Accordingly, he made even the scholars of his realm enlist in the army sent out against Baasha. He was punished by being afflicted with gout, he of all men, who was distinguished on account of the strength of his feet. Furthermore, the division between Judah and Israel was made permanent, though God had at first intended to limit the exclusion of David's house from Israel only to 36 years. Had Asa shown himself deserving, he would have been accorded dominion over all Israel. In point of fact, Asa, through his connection by marriage with the house of Omri, contributed to the stability of the Israelite dynasty. For, as a result of the support given by the southern ruler, Omri succeeded in putting his rival Tibni out of the way. Then it was that God resolved the descendants of Asa should perish simultaneously with the descendants of Omri. This doom was accomplished when Jehu killed the king of Judah on account of his friendship and kinship with Joram, the king of Samaria. Jehoshaphat and Ahab. The successors of Omri and Asa, each in his way, were worthy of their fathers. Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, was very wealthy. The treasures which his father had sent to the Aramean ruler reverted to him in consequence of his victory over the Ammonites, themselves the conquerors of the Arameans, for they had taken their possessions. His power was exceedingly great. Each division of his army counted no less than 160,000 warriors. Yet, rich and powerful as he was so modest that he refused to don his royal dress when he went to the house of the prophet Elisha to consult him. He appeared before him in the attire of one of the people. Unlike his father, who had little consideration for scholars, Jehoshaphat was gracious toward them. When a scholar appeared before him, he arose, hurried to meet him, and kissing and embracing him, greeted him with, "Rabbi, Rabbi, it's so good to see you." Jehoshaphat concerned himself greatly about the purity and sanctification of the temple. He was the author of the ordinance forbidding anyone to ascend the Temple Mount whose term of uncleanness had not yet expired, even though he had taken the ritual bath. His implicit trust in God made him a complete contrast to his skeptical father. He turned to God and implored his help when to human reason, help seemed an utter impossibility. In the war with the Arameans, an enemy held his sword at Jehoshaphat's very throat, ready to deal the fatal blow. But the king entreated God's help, and it was granted. In power and wealth, Ahab, king of Samaria, outstripped his friend Jehoshaphat. For Ahab is one of that small number of kings who have ruled over the whole world. No less than 252 kingdoms acknowledged his dominion. As for his wealth, it was so abundant that each of his 140 children possessed several ivory palaces, summer and winter residences. But what gives Ahab his prominence among the Jewish kings is neither his power nor his wealth, but his sinful conduct. Compared to him, the gravest transgressions committed by Jeroboam were slight peccadillos. At his order, the gates of Samaria bore the inscription, "Ahab denies the God of Israel." He was so devoted to idolatry, to which he was led astray by his wife Jezebel, that the fields of Palestine were full of idols. But he was not wholly wicked. He possessed some good qualities. He was gracious toward scholars and showed great reverence for the Torah, which he studied zealously. When Ben-Hadad exacted all he possessed, his wealth, his wives, and his children, he acceded to his demands regarding everything except the Torah. That he refused to surrender. In the war that followed between himself and the Syrians, he was so indignant at the presumptuous of the Aramean upstart that he himself saddled his war horse for the battle. His zeal was rewarded by God. He gained a brilliant victory in the battle, in which no less than 100,000 of the Syrians were slain, as the prophet Micaiah had foretold him. The same seer admonished him not to deal gently with Ben-Hadad. God's word to him had been, "Understand that I had to set many a pitfall and trap to deliver him into your hand. If you let him escape, your life will be demanded for his." Nevertheless, the disastrous end of Ahab is not to be ascribed to his disregard to the prophet's warning, for he later freed Ben-Hadad, but chiefly to the murder of his kinsman, Naboth, whose execution on the charge of treason he had ordered so that he might put himself in possession of Naboth's wealth. His victim was a pious man, in the habit of going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the festivals. As he was a great singer, his presence in the holy city attracted many other pilgrims. Once, Naboth failed to go on his customary pilgrimage. It was then that this false conviction took place, a very severe punishment for the transgression. Under Jehoshaphat's influence and counsel, Ahab did penance for his crime, and the punishment meted out by God was therefore mitigated to the extent that his dynasty was not cut off from the throne at his death. In the heavenly court of justice, at Ahab's trial, the accusing witnesses and his defenders exactly balanced each other in number and statements, until the spirit of Naboth appeared and turned the scale against Ahab. It was also the spirit of Naboth that led astray the prophets of Ahab, making them all use the very same words in prophesying a victory at Ramoth-Gilead. These literally same words aroused Jehoshaphat's suspicion and caused him to ask for a prophet of the Lord. For the rule is, the same thought is revealed to many prophets, but no two prophets express it in the same words. Jehoshaphat's mistrust was justified by the result of the war. Ahab was slain in a miraculous way by Naaman, at the time only a common soldier of the rank and file. God permitted Naaman's missile to penetrate Ahab's armor, though the armor was harder than the spear. The grieving for Ahab was so great that the memory of it reached posterity. The funeral procession was unusually impressive. No less than 36,000 warriors, their shoulders bared, marched before his casket. Ahab is one of the few in Israel who have no portion in the world to come. He dwells in the 5th division of the netherworld, which is under the supervision of the angel Oniel. However, he is exempt from the tortures inflicted on his heathen associates. Jezebel. Wicked as Ahab was, his wife Jezebel was incomparably worse. Indeed, she is in great part the cause of his suffering, and Ahab realized it. Once, Rabbi Levi expounded the scriptural verse in which the iniquity of Ahab and the influence of his wife over him are discussed, dwelling on the first half for 2 months. Ahab visited him in a dream and reproached him with expiating on the first half of the verse to the exclusion of the latter half. Then the rabbi took the second half of the verse as the text of his lectures for the next 2 months, demonstrating all the time that Jezebel was the instigator of Ahab's sins. Her misdeeds are told in the Scriptures, but to those must be added her practice of attaching unchaste images to Ahab's chariot for the purpose of stimulating his carnal desires. Therefore, those parts of his chariot were splattered with blood when he fell at the hand of the enemy. She also had her husband weighed every day, and the increase of his weight in gold she sacrificed to the idol. Jezebel was not only the daughter and wife of a king, she was also co-regent with her husband, the only reigning queen in Jewish history except Athaliah. Hardened sinner though Jezebel was, even she had good qualities. One of them was her capacity for sympathy with others, in joy and in sorrow. Whenever a funeral cortege passed the royal palace, Jezebel would descend and join the ranks of the mourner, and also, when a marriage procession went by, she took part in the merrymaking. By way of reward, the limbs and organs with which she executed these good deeds were left intact by the horses that trampled her to death in Jezreel. Joram of Israel. Of Joram, the son of Ahab, it can only be said that he had his father's faults without his father's virtues. Ahab was generous, Joram miserly. He even indulged in usurious practices. From Obadiah, the pious protector of the prophets in hiding, he exacted a high rate of interest on the money needed for their support. As a consequence, at his death he fell pierced between his arms, the arrow going out at his heart. For he had stretched out his arms to receive usury and had hardened his heart against compassion. In his reign only one event deserves mention, his campaign against Moab, undertaken in alliance with the kings of Judah and Edom, and ending with a splendid victory won by the allied kings. Joram and his people, it need hardly be said, failed to derive the proper lesson from the war. Their disobedience to God's commands went on as before. The king of Moab, on the other hand, in his own way sought to come nearer to God. He assembled his astrologers and inquired of them why it was that the Moabites, successful in their warlike enterprises against other nations, could not measure up to the standard of the Israelites. They explained that God was gracious to Israel because his ancestor Abraham had been ready to sacrifice Isaac at his bidding. Then the Moabite king reasoned that if God set so high a value on mere good intention, how much greater would the reward be for its actual execution? And he, who ordinarily was a sun worshipper, proceeded to sacrifice his son, the successor to the throne, to the God of Israel. God said, "The heathen do not know me, and their wrongdoing arises from ignorance. But you, Israel, know me, and yet you act rebellious towards me." As a result of the 7 years' famine, conditions in Samaria were frightful during the greater part of Joram's reign. In the first year, everything stored in the houses was eaten up. In the second, the people supported themselves with what they could scrape together in the fields. The flesh of the clean animals sufficed for the third year. In the fourth, the sufferers resorted to unclean animals. In the fifth, the reptiles and insects. And in the sixth, the monstrous thing happened that women crazed by hunger consumed their own children. But the height of distress was reached in the 7th year, when men sought to gnaw the flesh from their own bones. To these occurrences the prophecies of Joel apply, for he lived in the awful days of the famine in Joram's reign. Luckily, God revealed to Joel at the same time how Israel would be rescued from the famine. The winter following the 7 years brought no relief, for the rain held back until the first day of the month of Nisan. When it began to fall, the prophet said to the people, "Go forth and sow seed." But they remonstrated with him. "Will one who has saved a measure of wheat or 2 measures of barley not use his store for food and live, rather than seed and die?" But the prophet urged them, "No, go and sow seed." Then a miracle happened. In the anthills and mouse holes they found enough grain for seed, and they cast it on the ground on the second, the third, and the fourth day of Nisan. On the 5th day of the month, the rain fell again. 11 days later, the grain was ripe, and the offering of the omer could be brought at the appointed time, on the 16th of the month. Of this the psalmist was thinking when he said, "They that sow in tears will reap in joy." Elijah before his translation. The Bible account of the prophet Elijah, of his life and work during the reigns of Ahab and his son Joram, gives but a faint idea of a personage whose history begins with Israel's sojourn in Egypt, and will end only when Israel, under the leadership of the Messiah, will have taken up his abode again in Palestine. The Scripture tells us only of the name of Elijah's home, but it must be added that he was a priest, identical with Phinehas, the priest zealous for the honor of God, who distinguished himself on the journey through the desert and played a prominent role in the time of the judges. Elijah's first appearance in the period of the kings was his meeting with Ahab in the house of Hiel, the Bethelite, the commander-in-chief of the Israelite army, who he was visiting to console him for the loss of his sons. God himself had charged the prophet to offer sympathy to Hiel, whose position demanded honor. Elijah at first refused to seek out the sinner who had violated the divine injunction against the rebuilding of Jericho, for he said that the blasphemous talk of such evildoers always called forth his rage. Then God promised Elijah that success would prevail in his mission, even though his wrath might explode against the godless for their unholy speech. As the prophet entered the general's house, he heard Hiel utter these words, "Blessed be the Lord God of the pious, who grants fulfillment to the words of the pious." Hiel thus acknowledged that he had repented because of Joshua's curse against him. He should have rebuilt Jericho. Ahab mockingly asked Elijah, "Was not Moses greater than Joshua, and did he not say that God would let no rain descend on the earth if Israel served and worshipped idols? There is not an idol known to which I do not pay homage. Yet we enjoy all that is goodly and desirable. Do you believe that if the words of Moses remain unfilled, the words of Joshua will come true?" Elijah rejoined, "Be it as you say. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be dew nor rain." Because of his promise, God had to execute the words of Elijah, and neither dew nor rain watered the land. A famine ensued, and Ahab sought to wreak his vengeance on the prophet. To escape the king's persecutions, Elijah hid himself. He was sustained with the food brought from the stores of the pious King Jehoshaphat by ravens, which at the same time would not even approach the house of the sinful Ahab. God, who has compassion even on the impious, tried to induce the prophet to release him from his promise. To influence him, he made the brook which Elijah drank from run dry. As this failed to soften the inflexible prophet, God resorted to causing him pain through the death of the son of the widow, who Elijah was residing with, and by whom he had been received with great honor. When her son, who was later known as the prophet Jonah, died, she thought God, who had formerly been gracious to her on account of her worthiness as compared with her neighbors and the inhabitants of the city, now had abandoned her, because her virtues had become as nothing compared to the great prophet. In his distress, Elijah supplicated God to revive the child. Now God had the prophet in his power. He would answer Elijah's prayer only if the prophet released him from the promise about a drought, for resuscitation from death is brought about by means of dew, and this remedy was precluded so long as Elijah kept God to his word about withholding dew and rain from the earth. Elijah saw that there was no choice but to yield. First, however, he went to Ahab with the purpose of overcoming the obduracy of the people, on whom the famine had made no impression. Manifest wonders displayed before their eyes were to teach them wisdom. The combat between God and Baal took place on Carmel. The mountain that had thought itself the proper place for the great event in Israel's history, the revelation of the law, was compensated by the many miracles now performed on it. for its disappointment at Sinai's having been preferred. The first wonder occurred in connection with the choice of the bulls. According to Elijah's arrangement with Ahab, one was to be sacrificed to God, and then one to Baal. A pair of twin bulls, raised together, were brought before the contestants, and it was decided by lottery which belonged to God and which to Baal. Elijah had no difficulty with his offering, quickly leading it to his altar. But all the priests of Baal, 850 in number, could not make their victim stir a foot. When Elijah began to speak persuasively to the bull of Baal, urging it to follow the idolatrous priests, he opened his mouth and said, "We two bulls came from the same womb. We took our food from the same manger, and now he has been destined for God as an instrument for the glorification of the divine name, while I am to be used for Baal as an instrument to enrage my Creator." Elijah urged, "Just follow the priests of Baal that they may have no excuse, and then you will have a share in the glorification of God." The bull, "So you say, but I swear I will not move from the spot unless you, with your own hands, deliver me." Elijah then led the bull to the priests of Baal. In spite of this miracle, the priests sought to deceive the people. They undermined the altar, and Hiel hid himself under it with the purpose of igniting a fire at the mention of the word Baal. But God sent a serpent to kill him. In vain the false priests cried and called, "Baal, Baal," but the expected flame did not shoot up. To add to the confusion of the idolaters, God had imposed silence on the whole world. The powers of the upper and lower regions were quiet. The universe itself seemed deserted and desolate, as if without a living creature. If a single sound had made itself heard, the priests would have said, "It is the voice of Baal." That all preparations might be completed in one day, the erection of the altar, the digging of the trench, and whatever else was necessary, Elijah commanded the sun to stand still. "For Joshua," he said, "you stood still that Israel might conquer his enemies. Now stand still, neither for my sake, nor for the sake of Israel, but that the name of God may be exalted." And the sun obeyed his words. Toward evening, Elijah called for his disciple Elisha and told him to pour water over his hands. A miracle happened. Water flowed out from Elijah's fingers until the whole trench was filled. Then the prophet prayed to God to let fire descend, but in such a way that the people would know it to be a wonder from heaven, and not a magician's trick. He spoke, "Lord of the world, you will send me as a messenger at the end of time, but if my words do not meet with fulfillment now, the Jews cannot be expected to believe me in the latter days." His pleading was heard, and fire fell from heaven on the altar, a fire that not only consumed what it touched, but also licked up the water. Nor was that all. His prayer for rain was also granted. Scarcely had the words dropped from his lips, "Though we have no other merits, remember the sign of the covenant which the Israelites bear on their bodies," when the rain fell to the earth. In spite of all these miracles, even the 7,000 who had not bowed down to Baal were unworthy sons of Israel, for they paid homage to the golden calves of Jeroboam. The misdeeds of the people had swelled to such number that they could no longer reckon on the merits of the fathers to intercede for them. They had overdrawn their account. When they sank to the point of degradation at which they gave up the sign of the covenant, Elijah could control his wrath no longer, and he accused Israel before God. In the cleft of the rock in which God had once appeared to Moses and revealed himself as compassionate and long-suffering, he now met with Elijah, and conveyed to him by various signs that it would be better to defend Israel than accuse him. But Elijah in his zeal for God was inexorable. Then God commanded him to appoint Elisha as his successor, for he said, "I cannot do as you would have me do." Furthermore, God charged him, "Instead of accusing my children, journey to Damascus, where the Gentiles have an idol for each day of the year. Even if Israel has overthrown my altars and slain my prophets, what concern is it of yours?" The four phenomena that God sent before his appearance, wind, earthquake, fire, and a still small voice, were to instruct Elijah about the destiny of man. God told Elijah that these four represent the worlds through which man must pass. The first stands for this world, fleeting as the wind. The earthquake is the day of death, which makes the human body tremble and quake. Fire is the tribunal in Gehenna, and the still small voice is the last judgment, when there will be none but God alone. About 3 years later, Elijah was taken up into heaven, but not without first undergoing a struggle with the angel of death. He refused to let Elijah enter heaven at his translation, on the grounds that he exercised jurisdiction over all mankind. Elijah was not an exception. God maintained that at the creation of heaven and earth, he had explicitly ordered the angel of death to grant entrance to the living prophet. But the angel of death insisted that by Elijah's translation, God had given just cause for complaint to all other men, who could not escape the doom of death. Then God said, "Elijah is not like other men. He is able to banish you from the world. Only you do not recognize his strength." With the consent of God, a combat took place between Elijah and the angel of death. The prophet was victorious, and if God had not restrained him, he would have annihilated his opponent. Holding his defeated enemy under his feet, Elijah ascended to heaven. In heaven he goes on living for all time. There he sits recording the deeds of men and the chronicles of the world. He has another office besides. He is the psychopomp, whose duty is to stand at the crossways in paradise and guide the pious to their appointed places, who brings the souls of sinners up from Gehenna at the approach of the Sabbath and leads them back again to their merited punishment when the day of rest is about to depart, and who conducts these same souls, after they have atoned for their sins, to the place of everlasting bliss. Elijah's miraculous deeds will be better understood if we remember that he had been an angel from the very first, even before the end of his earthly career. When God was about to create man, Elijah said to him, "Master of the world, if it be pleasing in your eyes, I will descend to earth and make myself serviceable to the sons of men." Then God changed his angel name, and later, under Ahab, he permitted him to abide among men, that he might convert the whole world to belief that the Lord is God. His mission fulfilled, God took him again into heaven and said to him, "You are the guardian spirit of my children forever, so spread the belief in me throughout the whole world." His angel name is Sandalphon, one of the great and mightiest of the fiery angel host. As such, it is his duty to wreathe garlands for God out of the prayers sent aloft by Israel. Besides, he offers up sacrifices in the invisible sanctuary, for the temple was destroyed only apparently. In reality, it went on existing, hidden from the sight of ordinary mortals. Next, after his translation. End part 83 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.